Southern Fried Asian. I'm your host, Keith Chao. There's actually no guest this episode. I was lucky enough to join some folks on a panel at my old stomping grounds, Old Dominion University, to talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate and what we can do as a community. It was a great conversation. That panel, hosted by the Office of Intercultural Relations at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, will be the bulk of the episode, so stay tuned for that. Before we get to it, though, I wanted to shout out Vanity Fair for naming Southern Fried Asian one of their 10 essential podcasts created by AAPI. It is an honor to be named alongside my friends Phil Yu, Jeff Yang, Jen Yamato, Frank Xiong, and all the cool podcasts that they listed as essential podcasts by Asian American and Pacific Islander creators. I will put a link to that list from Vanity Fair in the show notes, so please check that out. Again, it's a high privilege, great honor, because I didn't think anyone actually listens to this podcast. So thank you, Vanity Fair, for listening, and thank you all out there who do listen to this podcast on a regular basis. I also want to give a shout out to Lisa Clark, the director of the Office of Intercultural Relations at ODU, for even thinking of me and welcoming me back to the ODU family to be part of this panel. I've said many times on this podcast, Old Dominion is where I formulated my Asian American identity. If it weren't for ODU, I probably wouldn't be hosting this podcast. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you, ODU. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Garber, who moderated the panel. He is the coordinator of LGBTQIA plus programs and initiatives in the Office of Intercultural Relations at Old Dominion University. And once again, thank you for listening to Southern Fried Asian. I'll see you on the other side.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with tonight's event. First off, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for attending tonight's panel discussion. My name is Andrew Garber. I'm the coordinator for the LGBTQIA plus initiatives at the Office of Intercultural Relations at ODU. I will be the semi-moderator for tonight's conversation. So thank you so much again for coming. Since the start of the pandemic last spring, Asian Americans have faced racist violence at a much higher rate than previous years. The New York Police Department reported that hate crimes motivated by anti-Asian sentiment jumped over 1,900% in New York City in 2020. Stop AAPI Hate, which is a reporting database that was created at the beginning of the pandemic as a response to the increase in racial violence, received over 2,800 reports of anti-Asian discrimination between March 19th of last year and December 31st. The violence has continued into 2021, and President Joe Biden signed an executive order denouncing anti-Asian discrimination shortly after taking office in January. It's been the combination of COVID-19 and a social climate inflamed by racial tensions that has finally brought the longstanding issue to the forefront. And after 8 people in the Atlanta area, including 6 Asian women, were killed at 3 spas, the national conversation has finally shifted to the unique racism and dangers members of the AAPI community face. In response, here at ODU, the Student Engagement and Enrollment Services, or SEAS division, gathered over 30 AAPI faculty, students, and allies to discuss as a community how we address AAPI violence and hate, not only from a historical perspective, but in this present day and time. From that meeting came the idea and push for tonight's panel discussion. As a community, ODU is joined together to share the unified message that when one of us is hurt, we all hurt. We are committed to supporting each other by continuing to learn from one another and listening to the stories we bear. So before we begin discussion, I'd like to introduce our community panelists. So first up, we have Tracie Liguid. Tracie is a communications specialist and community educator who is actually running for the House of Delegates, District 84 in Virginia Beach. She's not only connected to the local community, but also happens to be a friend and fan of Dr. Luisa Gloria, a poet and professor in ODU's English department. Tracie was a student of Dr. Gloria's phenomenal, to quote Tracie, phenomenal Asian American literature class. So welcome back to ODU, Tracie. The next panelist is Dr. Kim Hong Nguyen, who is a former ODU alumna who had leadership positions in the student organizations APASU and VSA. She loved her university experience so much that she went on to be a professor of communication arts at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, where she teaches and researches on race and gender in late capitalism. Welcome, Kim. Our next panelist is Nelly Palitzki, who currently resides in Norfolk, Virginia. She's an ODU alumna as well and held former leadership roles in ODU's Filipino American Student Association, FASA, as well as the Asian Pacific American Student Union, APASU. And as a yogi mom, she loves teaching yoga in her community and teaching life skills to her children. Welcome back as well, Nelly.
Hi, everyone.
Our next panelist is Veronica Salcedo, who is a second-generation queer lesbian Pinay, born and raised in Virginia Beach. As a public high school social studies teacher, Salcedo is especially proud of her students' work on oral history book projects with the Filipino American National Historical Society of Hampton Roads. She is also currently a PhD student at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and the focus of her studies is gender, race, and sexuality through lesbian, bisexual, and queer Filipinas experiences. Welcome, Veronica.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Andrew.
So happy to have you. And then our next panelist is Dr. Melody D Agbisi, who is also fellow ODU alumna and who received her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Human Services in 2006 and her PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision in 2019. She currently works as a mental health counselor and educator and serves as the Health Committee Chair for the Virginia Asian Advisory Board. So excited to have you, Melody. Welcome back.
To be back.
And our final panelist for tonight is Keith Chao, who is the creator of the online community, The Nerds of Color, and the host of the podcasts, so more than one, Hard Knock Life and Southern Fried Asian, the latter of which was recently named as an essential AAPI listen by Vanity Fair. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, NBC News, Wizard Magazine, Sci-Fi Wire, and the Center for Asian American Media. Also, a very cool fact about Keith is that in 1998, he founded the Asian Pacific American Student Union, APASU, here at ODU. So he was the OG. So it's so awesome to have the founding member of APASU with us tonight. Welcome, Keith.
Nice to be back.
So tonight is going to be all about having just a conversation and sharing stories with each other and with the audience. But to begin begin discussion, we wanted to do a check-in with you all because as leaders and educators in the AAPI community, it's clear how much that community means to you, and especially in your previous experience and professional lives. So how are you doing? And where are you at in the midst of today's current climate as it relates to being a member of the AAPI communities?
You stumped us on the first question, Andrew. Good job.
How are you doing?
So it's weird. Being in the space that I occupy, you mentioned, I founded the Nerds of Color, and we talk a lot about representation in media. And then for the last few years, it's been like this boom of Asian American representation, right? We have Crazy Rich Asians. We have, the number one movie in the country right now is Mortal Kombat, where like there's actually Asian people playing Asian characters, and it's wild, right? Like whitewashing is something that's considered, not appropriate anymore. And at the same time, where we having this, that was Shang-Chi, right? There's like a Marvel freaking superhero that's going to be Asian. And in the midst of all of that, like this representation on the screen, we're seeing, and we're also seeing, our vice president is Asian American. Like we have all this representation everywhere. And yet the stuff that's always been underlying, the stuff that's been, the model minority myth, the perpetual foreigner myth, all of that is brought up to the surface with coronavirus, with the former guy, fueling that flame. And so it's kind of like, one thing about being Asian American is you're kind of like used to the double consciousness. And I feel like in the last few years, it's like been brought to the surface because you've had to be like celebratory of like the success of folks like John Chu and, Kamala Harris. But at the same time, you're realizing you see your aunties and your titas and everyone being assaulted. And I just want to say one more thing too about like the notion of like where we're coming, like the solutions that we're coming up with. And I just want to put up front at the beginning of this panel that like more police is not the answer. So a lot of Asian Americans are saying we need more police in our neighborhood. No, we do not need more police. We do not need more police policing brown bodies in our neighborhoods. So that's not the answer. That's actually perpetuating the model minority myth that we need these folks to come in and protect us from those others. That's not the root of what's happening to the Asian American community. And secondly, if your hashtag Stop AAPI Hate doesn't include our 4 Sikh American brothers and sisters that were murdered in Indianapolis, then your Stop AAPI Hate hashtag is worthless, right? Like you mentioned the murders in Atlanta, and as tragic as that were, there was a mass shooting a few weeks later in Indianapolis where Sikh Americans were murdered. That's also a problem. So we just have to be inclusive in our solidarity. Wow, it's weird. I haven't said this on like the ODU campus in like 20 years. It's crazy.
I don't mind springboarding off of you, Keith. I feel like the more I do these panels, like the more I'm refining my model that I'm creating as I share like how I'm doing. So I'm a mental health counselor and I'm also a professor for counselors. So like I kind of created this model, but in my head it was like linear. But now as you were talking, I realized it's not linear, and like what in life is linear. So it's like, so the model is personal, professional, policy. So like I started off like trying to figure out in my head, like as a kid, like I knew from a young age, like I was different. I was Filipino American, right? And then, I moved that into like what does that say about me? Like, how can I navigate like being brown in a white society? And it moved to mental health, where the majority of like mental health, like theories and models are based on white Western male perspectives, right? Like, so it's kind of like fighting that every day. Like, yes, I'm a therapist, but its foundation is on white values and white culture. And then like trying to infuse and make sense of that within myself, but also within my clients. And then also within my students, now that I'm a professor too. And then now moving into government, like serving on the Virginia Asian Advisory Board as the health committee chair. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that this realm existed and how we have a voice to affect policy and include Asian Americans. Like with that declaration that the governor just made, and like that President Biden is making about like including Asian Americans. I feel like I've been saying this forever. Like we just want to be included. We want to be included in the data, the health data. We weren't counted when the pandemic started. So when our Filipino and Asian doctors were dying, they didn't know there was a need there to protect us. We weren't included in hate crime count. So they created AAPI, hate, anti-AAPI hate, stop hate. Now, I'm jumbling up the website. They just created that. We're just being counted. 2020, 3,700 like something reports. That's minuscule. There is 0 hate crimes reported against Asian Americans in Hampton Roads since 2019, 0. And yet I know personally aunties that were robbed outside an Asian store. Speaking to the FBI, they're just like, well, you guys need to report. You need to report so it can be counted. And then I'm like, okay, so if we report, what's the process? And they're like, oh, but we can't label it a hate crime because we need to know intent. Well, okay, FBI people, how do you find intent? Well, there has to be a pattern. Like maybe it's on social media. And I'm like, you guys are telling us we need to do this. And when we do it, you're still not reporting it as hate. Like, we want to be included in every aspect. Like, Keith, you're talking about media representation. Oh my gosh, we got one movie. Cool. I didn't know my reaction seeing Crazy Rich Asians in theater when the only Asian people were me and the people I came with. And looking around, I was like looking around. I had to watch it several times because the first time I was literally looking at the room and watching everyone's reactions. And that was what got me, that pierced me. I never knew what that felt like. I'm like kind of tearing up right now. It's like, I didn't even think about it until I said it right now. I didn't know what that felt like to have people that look like me on the big screen and have people that don't look like me care. We want to be included in the numbers. We don't want to be that foreign, like perpetual foreigner. So like when you're asking me how I'm doing, I'm trying to manage how I'm doing in this professional realm, in this personal realm, in this policy realm, and like trying to figure out like how can I be effective change at all these levels of myself and like how I am in the world. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's where I'm at.
No, I think you definitely did answer the question. And Keith and Melody, thank you both for mentioning like Crazy Rich Asians and like this like totally like weird time where like we're gaining representation in media, but also it's like, well, what kind of representation is it? And like, is it hurtful? Is it harmful? Is it good? Is it empowering in ways? And I don't think it's ever like one thing, right? Like Crazy Rich Asians definitely does not help the minority, the silent model minority stereotype, right? Like they're rich, they're economically fine. They don't have the widest gap in economic, like the widest economic gap than any other racial or ethnic group, right? That's totally not a thing. That is a thing, but there's an erasure there that's created because when the media gives us representation, it's a little bit complicated. And but thank you for mentioning that. And I think that that's really important to kind of point out the fact that like there's multiple things going on and they're all not kind of like complementing each other. There's a lot of polarizing things that are going on.
Yeah, and I would just say about that, with Crazy Rich Asians, like, the problem isn't Crazy Rich Asians, right? The problem is it's the only one. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Like the idea that like that the burden on that movie to be all things to all people was unfair to John and everyone involved in that film, right? Because it's, I think the symbolism of it being this blockbuster, big budget, romantic comedy with the backing of a studio that was, like that, the symbolism of that is what's important. The content is problematic, sure. Like everything is problematic. But the problem is not the content itself. The problem is it's the scarcity myth, right? Like we can only have one, so this one has to represent everybody. It's the like Jeremy Lin problem, right? Like I wasn't, I may get canceled by my Asian American basketball brothers, but like I wasn't that big a fan of Jeremy Lin, but I understood what he represented. Like after Linsanity, I was like, he's not that great. When everyone was like on Twitter and Facebook about like, why isn't he getting more playing time? I was like, well, he gets injured all the time. That's why. But because he was the only Asian American basketball player, we put all of our hopes and dreams on like one person. And that's the problem with representation sometimes when it's like, you don't have enough. Like what I argue for in my capacity is more stories, more diverse stories, more varied stories. It's not just the one story. Because, I used to say like, to me, like the sign that we've made it is a show like Dr. Ken, which was a mediocre, terrible sitcom on ABC. Right? It didn't have to be groundbreaking. It could just be like, God give me the confidence of a mediocre white sitcom. Because that's like, it lasted one season, but it showed that like, we don't have to be all things. It can just be this like dumb show. Like, I mean, that's what I love about Mortal Kombat, right? Like this is dumb action movie with Asian people in it. And it, you know, like the idea that this has to be representative of everything is the problem with, like, writ large, the lack of representation everywhere else. You know what I'm saying? So like, if we could just have more stories and people see our humanity, like, I'll tie this all to like Stop Asian Hate, because and I hate that hashtag too. I've said this before, but like, I Asian hate a lot of things, and I don't want to stop Asian hate because, like, anyway, sorry. But, you know, like, I think to me, the power of pop culture, the reason I like do all of this work within that space is that is the fount of like how we see ourselves, like the stories we tell each other, the narratives that we see. And, you know, if you permeate the culture and your humanity permeates the culture, right? Because up until now, before Crazy Rich Asians, up until that point, what were Asians seen as in movies and in television and in books, right? We were dragon ladies, we were, you know, opium gangsters, we were, you know, and the thing is, like, we were martial artists, but we were not human martial artists, right? Like, I don't run away from the martial arts stereotype. What I run away from the stereotype of the martial artist as like cannon fodder for like the white guy to beat up. But there was never like a human Asian American martial artist that had the humanity of someone like a Bruce Lee, right? Like, we didn't have those things to represent. So we were seen as non-human, subhuman. And this is not just Asian Americans. Why was Michael Brown shot in Ferguson? Because the police officer said, well, you know, I shot him and he was like this monster coming at me. Why did he think that? Because that's the way media portrays Black people in this country. There's these inhuman beasts that we must put down. That's been a message for 400 years in this country, right? So like, the stories we tell each other, the stories we tell ourselves makes a difference in how our humanity is displayed. And that's why I think, you know, people tuning into the Stop Asian Hate, why? Because this is the thing, like, a lot of Asian Americans get criticized for. It's like, we focus so much on like the pop culture piece and not the policy piece. But I don't divorce them. I think the pop culture piece is just as important as the policy. Because again, what's the number one export of America is our pop culture, right? How we view ourselves, how we view the world is through the culture that we export. And then if we see ourselves as human in that culture, I think that will eventually permeate and resonate with everyone else.
Sounds like I'm adding another P to my model, Keith.
I'll hop in now, if that's okay, into the conversation. I know that I would just mention this here about Stop Asian Hate, that while that hashtag was not considered very ideal by a lot of the Asian American community, the hashtag itself was developed by the activists who were trying to mobilize a conversation around what was going on in their community in Oakland. And so that's how it started. It started as a small sort of Asian American kind of hashtag for the activist community, and then it kind of ballooned out from there. So I think that, you know, whether or not it should be, if there should be another hashtag to sort of represent what is going on nationwide, I think is probably another conversation. But to answer the question about, you know, checking in and how we're doing, I think that for me, what I've been seeing happening and what has been going on has really strengthened my resolve in deepening and talking about and really engaging in Asian racial consciousness. When I say Asian racial consciousness, I think that one piece of it is certainly representation, but I think it's also about what that representation does and how it fits into a larger conversation around race. And so for me, Asian consciousness isn't simply about, you know, making sure that you learn your culture and you practice, you know, your various different ways and have a sense of who you are as an Asian person. But it's also seeing Asianness and race within white supremacy. You know, to take the example of And we've already said that this is a flawed example, of Crazy Rich Asians, right? It's like, I think while it definitely brought to the fore a conversation about Asian consciousness and the importance of Asian representation, what was in the background and perhaps not something that was talked about was how those representations fit in with conversations around race, right? So, for example, to get into some specifics about Crazy Rich Asians, right? Aquafina, for example, could be seen as a character who is mocking hip hop culture, right? And who is mocking or, replicating and reproducing a kind of anti-Blackness. And that is really problematic when we're trying to address white supremacy in its entirety, right? And same with what Keith was saying earlier about the importance of not, recommending or encouraging more policing in our communities, right? We know for a fact that policing harms racialized bodies, in particular Black people, in ways that brown people are not necessarily subject to. And so when we're talking about Asian consciousness and we're thinking it through, it's really important to think about how that Asianness is being put in distinction with whiteness and white supremacy.
And I think you can't talk about that without talking also about Asian American proximity to whiteness, right? Like in that, yes. and a lot of what gets bundled up in a lot of these conversations about representation is this like yearning for hyper visibility, but like sometimes be careful what you wish for, right? Because like why do we like I bristle at like the racial oppression Olympics that happens a lot with like within the Asian American community, because you talk about like, we have to unpack the anti-Blackness in a lot of our communities, because we do, I think, the Asian hate crime, like there's a component of it that is still anti-Black, right? Like there's the glee that some people I see on social media when they arrested the guy, again, it was terrible that he beat up this lady in front of a hotel building, but like, you just like J. Caspian Kang, the writer, kind of got called to task, but I actually agree with him. Like, we're this close to like someone falsely accusing a Black man for beating someone Asian, and then what when you call the cops on him? You know what I mean?
And on that note, that's I'm glad that you mentioned it, right? Like that a lot of the events that we learn about, the incidents that we learn about that are perhaps perpetuated or perpetrated by Black folks, right? They often fulfill the stereotypes that the media want to, right, latch onto, right, which is Black male aggression, right, and Asian passivity, right. And so when we're talking about, even when we're talking about Crazy Rich Asians, and we're not talking about its anti-Blackness component per se by, problematic characters, it's important to also sort of be mindful of how the model minority that is part of what makes Crazy Rich Asians kind of sexy, right, was theorized as an effort to sort of distinguish minorities from each other, right? To distinguish the model minority, which would be Asian Americans, against what was considered the problem minorities, which were Black and African Americans, right? And so that's also important to sort of contextualize when we're thinking about the conversation around Asian American identity and Asian hate crimes and what's been going on.
And just one more point on that. I think it's the way whiteness weaponizes the Asian American identity too, right? Because if you think of like the fights around affirmative action, if you think about even, talking about police violence, the Peter Liang case in New York City when a Chinese American officer killed a Black man, an unarmed Black man. There was actually a great documentary about that by my friend Ursula Liang that just came out on PBS called Down a Hallway Darkly, I think is the name of it. I could be getting that wrong, sorry, Ursula. But, those, again, we have to unpack the anti-Blackness from Asian consciousness, right? Because I think they do get tied up and they get weaponized because, and this is not to say all Asian American activists are anti-Black. That's not the case at all. In fact, there is a lot of work happening in the activism space by Asian Americans that is doing that work that Kim's talking about. But what happens in the mainstream media, a lot of that gets weaponized when a lot of Asian American groups use the language of social justice in their anti-affirmative action activism, right? And it's kind of like this, like hypocritical, I mean, cynical, not hypocritical. It's like cynical, right? Like they use the language of social justice in this, like, where we're just trying to uplift Asians, and that's why we don't want affirmative action in colleges anymore, right? And that's the thing that we have to be careful of when we talk about these hashtags, when we talk about this activism, when we talk about Asian identity. We can't talk about it in conflict with other marginalized groups, other people of color, other groups of color, because solidarity is where the answer lies, not in division, not in because the model minority is designed to be a wedge, to draw that division, to uphold white supremacy. And there are a lot of Asian Americans who would rather uphold white supremacy than build solidarity.
Right, or not just in conflict with, but also not imagine that Asian identity can be talked about as if it were in isolation from everything else, right? That it is that one should advocate or should be able to advocate for Asian politics without necessarily engaging in other kinds of politics, and that's a very problematic view.
Well, I think, Kim, that's an excellent point, because to talk about anti-Asian sentiments and AAPI hate within the current climate, to talk about that like within its own, like as if it exists within a vacuum and is not directly stemming or related to in some kind of way to white supremacy, which helps to operationalize anti-Blackness as well, is counterproductive. We can't address the issues that directly affect us without acknowledging how they are related to other communities. So thank you for bringing that up. Professor Francis just joined us. Professor Francis, hello, how are you? Thank you so much for coming. We just began the conversation, and we're literally just kind of asking the panelists how they're doing and responding in that way, and conversation is kind of growing organically from there. So welcome.
Hey y'all, thank you for everyone sharing. I've been thinking a lot about what's been said, and it's refreshing and energizing to be hearing this. It's not just in my head. I'm not just crazy. Like, this is real. What I'm feeling is real. What I've studied in theory is real. What I'm struggling with still in this moment is how the theory and the representation politics, the model minority-ness, the anti-Blackness that coexists with anti-Asianness that coexists within a white supremacist society. And I also need to find a way to articulate this. I feel the need to articulate this to friends and family who aren't in this Zoom, who aren't taking courses, who aren't in universities, who are not likely to sign up for the next public demonstration of any sort. I think that's where I've always struggled, and that's something I actually do a lot to my students when I did teach introduction to sociology classes. I would ask them, what would this conversation look like in real life? Like, this is the theory. So how would you talk to that problematic uncle when you go home for Thanksgiving break? Or how do you break it down as the cool auntie to that niece or that nephew? And I think for me, I've learned so much from my students, and I'm inspired, and I'm also I still struggle. I am still unsure how to have these kinds of conversations, tough conversations with people who might see or might hear these words that we're expressing and sharing these sentiments as too radical, too extreme, you're rocking the boat. And so kind of walking back to the original question and thinking back to, where are we and how are we doing? I was living in Atlanta to work on my graduate studies. And I was aware of the verbal and physical harassment of Asian folks in Atlanta, right? In Atlanta at the onset of COVID. And even though I was living and working in a very racially and ethnically diverse place, like it became more real for me when a friend of mine went to the DeKalb Farmers Market. It's a warehouse size international grocery store. All right, imagine a warehouse size grocery store like Costco, but better because it's got like everything from Caribbean foods, fresh fish, Asian vegetables, spices galore. And she was verbally harassed at the checkout line and no one intervened. And she declined to report it. And when she shared that with me, it just made me realize again that no matter how many letters we have at the end of our names, no matter what title or office we hold, when people see this and interpret this in some sort of way that they feel entitled to lash out, it's a scary place. And it's scarier when folks don't want to report or talk about it. And I think for me, that's where a lot of my calling, my instinct to teach and to interact with students comes to mind, even if those students are close friends or distant friends, even if they're not in my class. You know, I think after that moment, I realized even more so, like, do I really need to get milk? Can I get other groceries altogether so I can just have one interaction and stay in my apartment and grade papers online? You know, I think that's where I was for a while until I moved back to Virginia, where I am currently working on my dissertation from home and taking an online class. And I have to say, when the events in Atlanta happened, when we lost those lives, I was very numb, I was very angry, I was grieving. And I let myself feel those feelings. I don't think in my old self, I would allow myself to feel those feelings and acknowledge them as my feelings and that they're valid. I also don't think, prior to going to Atlanta and attending graduate school and meeting some pretty amazing people, shout out to you, Christina, in the audience. Prior to going to Atlanta, I don't think I would have found space to be with other folks who would get it. Perhaps my students at Bayside High School could have been like a support for me, but at the same time, it's like, I imagine that students of any sort would probably need their teachers and their professors to be present for them to lean on. And so I have to say, taking an online class was probably my saving grace. My professor and classmates carved out time in the class to actually just hold space, decompress, debrief, and explicitly say to me and another Asian woman in our critical race theory class, we support you. We are here for you. We see you. And I don't think I was getting that kind of support anywhere else, which also breaks my heart. And I have to say, I had to reach out to a lot of people to check in on them, because I didn't know until, I think, Melody, you had alluded to earlier, I didn't know that, you know, aunties were being robbed in daylight outside of, I think it's Mixed Oriental is what I learned. You know, reconnecting with friends like Amy and Mary Chris helped me realize I'm not alone. There's bad stuff going on, and we can still pick up. We can still mobilize, we can still pick up, we can try to hold space. I think that's what I did, was that with this frustration and grief and anger, was try to find an outlet. And I wasn't teaching at the time. I was taking a course online. I felt very isolated, doing my thing as, you know, as socially distant as possible and staying indoors, and just realizing that, you know what, maybe through other folks who are more established in the Virginia Beach area, because I'm, I guess, relearning my roots here after being away for 5 years, folks like Mary Chris and Amy took the lead in trying to organize a candlelight vigil. Now imagine trying to set up an event that is not associated with an institution, that doesn't have the stamp of ODU, that doesn't have William and Mary attached to it. For me, it's different, and it's hard, and it's rewarding, and it's frustrating. And even though that vigil has yet to occur, which I do hope it will occur, outside of typical institutions that we usually lean on to facilitate or to advertise or to host said Zoom events or hold candlelight space, I really do hope that it's a chance to start having conversations with our aunties and uncles, and to have conversations across within and outside of the Filipino American community. I don't think I'm alone. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's necessary. I have yet to fully articulate what that might look like or what that might sound like, but I know that, similar to my research, that a lot of the intersectional experiences and things that I've learned that in terms of how race and gender and sexuality are not separate entities, that they're intersected. They build each other, and for us to find solutions or to find community, these are concepts of power that we need to understand. And we need to be able to express that to each other in ways that are not academically, or like with academic high talk, so to speak. I think probably the biggest thing that helped me heal is, even though I'm still struggling with doing all that we do, and shout out to all the folks out there who are parenting and working and doing the hustle, all while surviving the pandemic. And I think for me, the thing that really helped me feel less alone was listening to undergrad students at William and Mary and hearing students at a student-led event, a student-organized, student-driven event, and hearing them talk about how we can support each other, make space for our grief, and also recognize that while anti-Black prejudice and anti-Asian prejudice exists at the same time, it does not stop us. It doesn't hold us back. It should not let us stop the potential for collaborating and talking and getting to know each other, and hopefully moving towards a visible presence, not just representation for the sake of being representative, but a type of representation that means we hold our power, we recognize our power, and that we will demand things such as disaggregated data, access to multilingual services, whether it be voting or access to health services in relation to the pandemic. Like I remain hopeful. I know that I was not hopeful about a month ago. I was very angry and upset and numb, and there's some days I feel like that. And there are days when I'm like, maybe one day I'll be able to talk openly and with my blood family, my family of origin, like the folks who I love dearly, my mom and my dad, my aunties and uncles. And I hope that I can say these things in a way that gives me hope that our older generation and our younger generations can work together. So thanks.
I'd like to interject. And Veronica, I want to help you with that candlelight event. And I love that you're talking about, rebuilding identity. And what's funny is, my background is news. And so when the Atlanta shooting happened, there's an automatic coping mechanism with this information. And it wasn't until my niece, who is in her second year at William and Mary, when I found out she was upset by the Asian, the shootings in Atlanta of the Asians and the others, that's when I felt upset. So I had already put this news story in a category of a national news story. We've had our mass shootings here in Virginia Beach. We've had, we have shootings at the oceanfront. So my heart was closed to this story until my niece was upset. And she had even come home to, check on us. So, thank you for bringing that up and being there for the William and Mary people, because maybe my niece was part of that conversation. But what you're talking about in the importance of empowering ourselves, that's the key, isn't it? I think was it Martin Luther King who said we changed the laws, but we didn't change ourselves? If that's the right, if he actually said that. We have to own, our own biases, and we have to address, the separateness. Like you guys said, we were all raised within a white supremacist framework. And that conversation of anti-Blackness is more than needed, especially in Virginia Beach. I'm looking at my peers here, and we all struggle with this with our own families. And it's a scary conversation to have, but it's such a necessary conversation to have. you guys, or most people, I think Andrew mentioned I'm running for public office, and I'm talking to potential voters, and I talked to a man who's a 68-year-old African American, and I start the conversation with what concerns you now, and he gets the anti-Asian American or anti-Asian hate situation, but he is also frustrated by it because he's like, hey, I'm sorry that this is happening, but hey, this has been happening to us worse for much longer. And, he told me how he has seen a lot of Asian Americans distance themselves from Black people, African Americans, where he has in his lifetime felt put down by Asians. And I just listened because I know that is within our culture. And I told him that I made a commitment, and this is something that I thought about before, but I made a commitment to him that, I wanted to help our community stand in solidarity, our Asian American, our Filipino American, however you want to identify me, help our community stand with those who have been disenfranchised and ignored and who are unprotected and endangered every day. So yeah, I mean, this anti-Blackness conversation, the framework, expanding that conversation to our whole community, like all of us are doing, Melody, Nelly, in our everyday lives. Yeah, we need to be courageous and open it up to our aunties and uncles. We have to. It's our duty to raise that awareness. That is going to be a difficult conversation, but it's the right conversation to be having. And I don't know, let's figure it out.
Tracie, when you mentioned the Atlanta shooting, that was the first time that I started realizing what was really happening in the world outside of this pandemic bubble that I've been living in. I'm also in a toddler town bubble. I have 2 kids. I have a 3.5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so unfortunately, Michelle Kim couldn't make it tonight. She was really upset that she couldn't be here. But she was the one, when I called her, she answered her phone like sobbing. And I didn't know what was happening. I was like, what happened? Are you okay? I heard about Atlanta. And she's just sobbing. I'm just like, whoa, what in the world? Like, I hadn't even heard anything on the news yet. Because again, I'm not watching regular TV. I put social media down when I'm taking care of the kids. And it's not until I get on social media that I'm all like, oh, snap. Like, here's all this stuff people are posting about it. And here's my bestie on the phone telling me, I can't believe this has happened. Like, she's out of it. And I'm all like, what in the world? Like, I started like, almost like, it was like retroactive, like remembering when I was back in college and like stuff was happening where, affecting my identity as an Asian American woman and things like that. And then I started thinking about, well, what can I do? What can I do to help my community? Like, I feel so far away from, like, it's been 20 years since I've had conversations like this, where we're talking to, this kind of level with very like minds and just, sharing like our theories about things and what's happening in our community. But now that I'm, reflecting back on it, it's like, especially having children and being a mom, my question is now, how do I explain these things to my children? Just like Tracie, you were talking about, how do you have these conversations? And V, you were talking about, how do you have these conversations with your loved ones? Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm still in this pandemic bubble with my kids, so they're not around like a lot of people yet. They're not around to see the diversity except for, watching Daniel Tiger on the TV or whatever, and seeing the different shows on PBS and whatnot. But it's going to be a serious conversation to have with them. Like, I've been Googling like how to talk to your children, and it's good that we have resources, but we need to know that we do have them. And I feel that even if I don't have the answers, even for this panel discussion, if I don't have the answers for my children, I at least know that I know how to find the answers from all of you. I know I can connect to you, and y'all are going to be there and you're going to help. And that's why I'm like, I love events like this, and I'm glad I could reach out. I was like, I knew Kim, like, come on, Kim. Oh, Keith, please answer your email. You know, and I was like, I seeing all the other names. It's like, I have hope. I have hope that even if there are no answers to it all, that I know that we can get together. We know how to get together and start finding some sort of, solution, or some sort of whatever, starting the conversation like we're doing now. Because this next generation, I mean, even Michelle, even though she can't be here, I just remember her telling me, she has I think he's 13 years old now, and he's half Korean, half white. And she told me that her peers, or his peers, excuse me, told him it was his fault that the pandemic happened. So how do you have this conversation with your child when fingers are being pointed at him? And he's like, what? What are you talking about? You know? And it's not their fault. It's not the children's fault that they're saying these things. It's a trickle effect all the way back, like historically, all the way back from everything that has been set into motion. But because we can get together like this, someone's gonna break it. Someone's gonna break that chain, and it always breaks at some point. It will break. Just like, we have cycles and life lessons that we're learning in our own personal lives with like whatever's happening with our parents. And somehow like we're the radical, some of us are the radical ones that changed, how our parents done things. I will raise my hand on that, being a yogi Filipina, and having my parents understand why I'm not using my degree. So so I am very thankful that if I don't have the answers, that I know how to get people together, to put our minds together, who to call. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Nelly, shout out to you again, to all the moms doing everything, hustling, managing, thriving during the pandemic. I think you said something that caught my imagination. It was about, how do I have these conversations? And I think one of the things I was like just kind of sketching out and brain dumping was like, I know we're not the only ones who need to be having a conversation, right? Like I'm pretty sure this is something we can all relate to, that, our visibility, our representation of Filipino Americans, Asian Americans, queer people of color, it's not in the curriculum. Like, we didn't learn about ourselves. We get to learn of our history. I didn't have a professor, Francis, back in the day. I graduated before I came to William and Mary. I caught one course at night with Luisa, Dr. Gloria. I think Dr. Suzara spoke at William and Mary once. And these were like just wisps and wisps I could try to grasp at. I'm like, okay, this is how I learn about myself. I have to like hope and stretch and look online for these special books that don't exist in my regular school library, that weren't in my curriculum. So I just kind of want to bring it back to the idea of conversations, is that I hope, and I'm still looking for ways to hold people accountable so that they step into their power as well. People who have the privilege to create these curriculums, the people who are either administrators or school board folks, or the people writing the curriculum for the state of Virginia. Like, I would like folks who have those avenues of power and those platforms to have those tough conversations within their own professional community, within their own families. I remember a white ally who had asked very politely, I want to know how I can support. I want to know how I can help and do better. And it was kind of, I was stuck. I wasn't quite sure what to ask of this white person who wants to stand in solidarity and support Asian American, Pacific Islander, and South Asian folks. Like, I was almost like stumped. I'm like, well, let me walk it back. How did I learn to care? How did I learn that this issue was something worth fighting for? And so I guess as a teacher in me, I asked them, please read, educate yourself, and then have those conversations with other white allies so that they too know the relationship of race, gender, sexuality, and immigration in the US. I'd be happy to teach that to you. Maybe you could take my course. But, jokes aside, like really, I want other folks to learn. Folks, of course, I want Asian American folks to also learn. I also ask of other folks who aren't Asian American, who don't identify or who don't see themselves amongst the victims in Atlanta. I'd like for them to also do the heavy lifting, if that means educating themselves and having conversations in the spaces that we may not have access to. I mean, honestly, like if we don't want cavities to form, we got to brush teeth, right? So it's a constant thing. It's a constant education, constantly brushing our teeth, constantly flossing, having access to being able to get a brush and toothpaste and floss, having access and being taught how to use the toothbrush and the toothpaste and the floss. Like if we want to prevent rot in our mouths, it's a process of constantly keeping it clean and knowing how to keep it clean. And part of me is like, all right, if we want to have our society be stronger and fortified and together rather than standing separately, there's a lot of maintenance that has to occur. And it can't just be us talking within our families. It's necessary, but there's also so much more around us, so that when Nelly, your little ones go to a school, that their teachers and administrators understand and recognize their humanity and are willing and open to teaching students that look like your children. That's my hope.
I'll also say, I don't know who else on the panel are parents, but I think as parents, our kids are already set up better than we were, right? Like, I think Kim mentioned this before we started recording, that like, I didn't even think about racial consciousness until I got to college, right? Like, I tell when I do speaking gigs, I tell people, because I'm a nerd and that's my whole like brand, that like for me, college was like going to Professor Xavier's School for the Gifted, right? Like you're a mutant your whole life, but you have all these powers, you don't know what to do with them, and you're outcast, everybody hates you for it. And then you get to this school, and like you meet other mutants like you. And then you form a team and you put your superpowers together, right? And you form the X-Men. And that's what it was for me when I got to ODU. And not until I got to my senior year at ODU. Yeah, we're the X people. We were the X people. And so like, but my daughter, she's also 13. She's already being raised in an anti-racist household, right? Like she's very conscious of her Asian Americanness at 13. You know what I'm saying? Because like the stuff we watch, the things we talk about, we read the news, like she's very aware. You know what I'm saying? She's got a lot of mixed friends at school. I mean, that's the other thing. I grew up in a really white town. That didn't help my racial consciousness either. But like, if she's being othered, she has the tools to know how to like confront that. You know what I'm saying? So like, I think having us as parents, like our kids are already 10 steps ahead of where we were when we were their ages. You know what I'm saying? Because like they're being brought up in an anti-racist household. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, is how do we not just raise tolerant kids? Like, I hate the idea of, I don't want to be tolerated. You tolerate a sunburn. You don't tolerate a human being. You know what I mean? I want you to be anti-racist. I want you to fight against injustice against other people. And that's something that we can do as parents. And the other thing too, I appreciate that, Veronica, you say that, you want to teach others. I mean, that's the teacher in you. I was a teacher. But I got to tell you, sometimes the labor that's required of us as people of color to educate white people, that free labor can be exhausting. I don't mind doing it for my kid, but like to like have fights with her teachers, to have fights with the school board, to have fights with the local town council or whatever, it's exhausting. It's not even just like the politics of it, just like, if like, swear to God, if a white dude came up to me and was like, how can I help you? I'd be like that scene of Malcolm X, like do nothing and just walk off, because it's exhausting. You know what I'm saying? But I mean, I think you're right. Like we do have to do the work, but I tell you, sometimes that work can be exhausting when you're always expected to be the one to like, assign the readings to the whoever's coming at you. Like, how can I be of service? You know what I'm saying? Like, they'll put a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, but then like will vote against like affordable housing in the neighborhood. Like that's that hypocrisy is like drives me crazy.
I just want to add, like, I'm listening to your stories, Nelly, Veronica, Tracie, Heath, and I'm like, man, I don't know where I would be without a master's degree in counseling, where I learn how to compartmentalize myself and to distance myself emotionally when I hear these things. I started off as a suicide counselor. And so my running joke, I tell my students and I tell my clients, right, is I paid $40,000 to learn how to talk to my mom. So like Veronica was saying, like how do I have these conversations with my parents, right? And so I paid $40,000 to learn how to have those conversations. But like we're talking about education, right? So like one big issue I have about history and like education is, it's taught through the white supremacy lens. It's taught through the white narrative. But I'm not sure how many of you are aware, our Secretary of Education in Virginia is Asian American. Secretary Carney, he's been working on changing the curriculum to have Asian narratives from Asian voices infused into the curriculum. So I think, adding to like more and more people are teaching their kids from home front about anti-racism. I hope that's a hope to you, if you didn't know about it before, that's coming in the state of Virginia. So I think that's amazing. Dial it back to our parents. Like, what does that look like? For me, what that looks like is having a big mouth and getting smacked when I was a kid because I'm calling out my mom for being racist and being sexist and being, derogatory towards people. Like, it was very trauma. And I love my mom. My mom taught me so much to be like a strong woman. Like, I'm Ilocana, like Ilocana women are strong. And I remember being a kid watching her talk down to the Walmart cashier because she was just a cashier. And that was my first not under the table W-2 job, And I was like, Mom, you can talk to people like that. Stop it, Melody. And today I can tell you she proudly stands up for human rights. And today I can proudly tell you that she's the auntie that posts like how you're not supposed to call people illegal. And she's the person that posts that you're not supposed to be racist. So it is, I was 10 when I started this process. And I was like, 30, 25? Like when I started seeing results, like it's a labor of love, and it really is, but it's possible. And like, you just start with the little things. Like now that I'm more refined, right? Or something, I think of everything, like I'm an educator. I think of everything in models and I think of everything in theories. So like, I'm thinking, what's my outcome? And going back to the brushing teeth analogy, right? It's like, how far back do you need to go in that education to support brushing teeth every day, right? Like, are they at, this is a toothbrush level? Or are they at, this is your teeth level? Or are they at like, you are a person with like different systems that you need to take, like how far back do you need to go back, right? Everyone's on a journey, everyone's on a level, and then you meet them where they are. And you do it based on your boundaries. You do it based on your energy. You do it based on your conviction. And that's a decision you make for every day. That's a decision you make every moment. Like, where am I with this person? Or where am I with myself? And so like, even the decision to have this conversation is multifaceted, right? It's like how much, when I first started in this, like I have these conversations all the time. When I first started in this, I'm like, what voice do I have? Who am I to educate you? Like, that's where I was at. I didn't know. I didn't know the language when I started. Who am I to educate you? I am an East Coast Filipino. I just learned, like meeting Dr. Bergano, that there are third generation Filipinos in this country. And there's even more. Now there's like fourth, fifth generation. Like the older I get, I'm like, oh, there's like children and children's children, right? Like when I was a kid, all I knew was that I'm first generation American. And that's all I knew, that like that was the level. And I meet Dr. Bergano, who's older than me, and he's third generation. And I'm like, how is that possible? I don't understand. Like, it didn't come. I created a model of counseling Filipino Americans mental health. I created a model. I lectured on that model to EVMS doctors. That model was based on the premise that the wave of Filipino Americans that came into Hampton Roads came in the 70s and 80s as a military. Like this wave of Filipino Americans coming were like more affluent because they had a job. They didn't come as laborers in the fields. And so like the perspective was different. So how ashamed do I feel looking back how like this is Melody Agbisi, master's in counseling, doctoral candidate, teaching about this model of mental health for Filipino Americans. And then later on, years after giving that lecture, I found out I was wrong and how ashamed I am to maybe perpetuating the model minority myth, maybe perpetuating these ideas that now I fight so strongly against. So we're all on this journey. So I guess I say that to say this, to have compassion towards people. I know our claws are up, right? Like 8 women were murdered. 6 of them were Asian Americans, right? Like F that, like we have a voice, we're strong, like we matter, claws out, right? Like stop Asian hate, like listen to us, hear us, see us, right? But then, like some people like, well, you are doing that wrong. You're advocating wrong. You are not saying enough. You don't know enough, like we're judging the people who are doing the work when we need to educate. So I'm not sure if I feel like I'm all over the place, but it's kind of like, even like with our parents, right? Going back to that conversation about the toothbrush, I'm all about analogies, like, having compassion towards our parents because they might not know what a toothbrush is. It's like teaching a toddler, right? Like they come out, they don't know how to walk, they don't know how to talk, they know how to cry, like they can't change their diaper, they can't use the bathroom. Like you teach them and like you see a toddler, I'm like, gosh, you took your first step. Oh my gosh, you said ma, right? Like every stage is praise. But then we criticize our parents for like not knowing, we criticize our fellow like Asian Americans for not knowing, we criticize white people, Black people for not knowing, where like there's no connection to where they're at. So
thank you, Melody. Professor Francis Aguas, I think you had your hand up if you wanted to go ahead and speak.
Thank you. No, there's no rush. Thank you for creating this space for us. I just want to acknowledge everything that's been said and to receive it, and I honor all of you. I think as someone who came to this country fully formed politically as a Filipino, I will share with you that when I was in university, just like with the batch 70s of the Asian American movement, we are now the parents, by the way. I might be the parents that maybe some of the panelists are speaking about. As you know, the movement was all about being American and fighting for that space to be American. And the irony of ironies is that when I received all my education, and once I had built Asian American Studies and Pacific Islander Studies at William and Mary, I actually began, and once my children, you're talking about what do you tell your children? I actually never told my children that you're American. I find no need. I find no need to attach that name. It's enough for me to be Filipino. It's like being Goan. When you say you're Goan from India, Portugal is already in there, right? But some people say I'm Goan, I'm actually Portuguese, then you tell the whole story. So I just want to share that for me, I'm just Filipino, and that is all I need. Because the story alone, if you Google what Filipino is, it's not just being American that is attached there. So take that with a grain of salt. So my children who are 16, 14, and 11, they just say they're Filipino. And I'm very clear to them, yes, you are a Filipino. Your home is the Philippines. You are descended of these people. We live here because I work here. And that is the story, I think, at the end of the day, of this country and all of us, including white people who came here, because at the end of the day, we all came here for a better life. So for me, I was liberated from all of this, albeit not necessarily the violence that's been inflicted on our sisters in Atlanta, but it was just so liberating to not want or need the acceptance of other people as to who I was, right? So the second one also is that because I am politically formed as a Filipino, I am very aware that being a Filipino, even to call myself a Filipino, and very similar to being Asian American, by the way, that being Filipino is in itself a political act. That by being Filipino, I am already a leader. And that is the reason that I come fully formed. It doesn't matter where I work. I would still, I believe, have created what I created wherever I was. So that's what I'm sharing with everybody here. Violent people will hurt who they hurt. White supremacy will do as it does. But what about all of us? Do we know what we're supposed to do? Because that is really what we have in our control. That when I was building Asian American Studies at William and Mary, I was under no delusion that it would change the world, right? That it would stop violence or anything at all. My concern was just, I want to find those Asian American students like me, a faculty member, who just need a family, who need a community. Because I'll tell you, I am the first person of color, tenured and fully professored, right? I have nowhere else to go. I'm full professor in the arts at William and Mary. That includes art history, theater, music, and not in the humanities, just the arts. So when I came to William and Mary, I knew that Professor Mario Zamora, who the late Professor Zamora had passed on in the 90s. I'm not the first Filipino there. My first act was for my own safety, and back then our 2-month-old, was to find other Filipinos. And that's really the only reason that I was able to build Asian American Studies and strengthen FASA, because at the end of the day, number one, like all of us here in the room, I needed a job. Number two, I needed a safe space, right? And that safe space was FASA, Filipino American Student Association. And from there, Veronica knows that I gave this 10 whiteboard or blackboard 2-hour workshop about, okay, if I'm going to be here for 10 years, here's our plan. It was really from the days of Sister Luisa Gloria will know, it was like being at University of the Philippines, Diliman, having a 10-year plan. Because if we want to live in this country, we should be under no delusion that we can just be a human being. No, all of us have got to be leaders. We may not run for public office, but Tracie, but everywhere we go, every second of our life is a tactic and strategy. And the sooner we tell that to our children, for me, again, about the reality of what is America, I think the sooner we will be freed. Because at least for me, it worked. Now, for my children, they were born here, but I don't stop them whenever they say they're American, because they don't. Right? For me, at the end of the day, my wife's favorite line, it doesn't matter where we go as long as we're together. And I know it's very cheesy. It's only a father could say that. But the thing is, we need to take care of our families. So it is about empowerment. It is about being proactive leaders. I will tell you that when I created Asian American Studies, as I moved in these spaces where it happens at William and Mary, number one, even if I scream and jump on the table, unless I start dancing or doing something extraordinary, they will not listen. Everything we were able to create at William and Mary, I am proud to say, was off my back and the students. It was free labor. Keith was the one who mentioned the free labor, and even Melody and Veronica. But the thing is, if I didn't do it, I would have been miserable. It is my investment in the next generation. And then number two, why don't they see us? Because we are not in their guilt yet. I'm not saying that we need to guilt trip them, but that is really how far removed we are in the consciousness of whiteness, right? For whatever it takes, I think we need to do it, that every second that we exist in these spaces, if we don't speak up for ourselves, number one, we accept that we cannot live the way we lived before Atlanta happened. because it already happened before. Vincent Chin already made that sacrifice, right? We can't wait for Bhagat Singh. We can't wait for the suicide of Bhagat Singh that happened in the 1920s, 1930s. If you all know that story, that he bought a house in Oakland and then his neighbors were torching his house. He already had a house and then he just wanted to go home to India and they refused to give him a passport, right? So he was like, I'm trapped. He committed suicide because he knew he was no longer Indian. They told him to get an Indian passport, right? But they refused to give him an American passport. That's why I said the passport, the citizenship, that is just the convenience of mobility. Let us not romanticize American identity, because when we do that, when we become aware of this is just all capitalism, this is just all labor, then we can really focus on the safe spaces like this that we're creating. So hopefully that's my contribution, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much for speaking and providing your perspective, Professor Francis. Nelly, I see that you have to leave to go teach your yoga class. So thank you so much for coming and participating. And we have a few more minutes left, so we can open this up for the attendees. If they have any questions, please drop that in the Q&A.
While we're waiting for questions, Andrew, maybe if I can just jump in real quick. I heard that we were talking, some of the folks were talking about education and compassion. And as an educator, of course, I have an interest in education. And of course, I want to have compassion. But I also want to acknowledge two things. One, which is that it can't stop at education, that we also need to do action. Right. The fact that there's still deportations happening after Trump legalized deporting Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans. That is still going on in the Biden era here. The fact that there's gentrification, active gentrification going on, I think, pretty soon we won't see, Chinatowns across, North America. And that's happening in my closest, big city, which is Toronto. The Chinatown is really becoming mostly white folks, and the restaurants that of that place are no longer going to be there post-pandemic. And the second thing that I wanted to mention, in addition to the importance of doing action, is that while compassion is an important part of recognizing race relations, I also embrace, to a certain extent, the dragon lady anger that is often attributed to Asian women, right? And that if someone here needs permission to be angry, I'm giving it to you. We have to give ourselves space to express our anger and to express our frustration. And one of the quotes that I really like is from Joni Jones, who wrote 6 Rules for Allies. And in it, the quote is, be loud and crazy so Black folk don't have to be, right? And I think that that's often how I feel. Like when I'm really, really angry, right? I do not want to educate people, right? When I'm really frustrated, it is very difficult for me to find words, right, to articulate that anger sometimes, especially like when, I'm in a meeting and people are saying ridiculous things, right? I just want to scream and yell at all of my colleagues, right? But I am grateful when, an ally finds the words to speak out about that injustice, right? And so I just wanted to say that, this is also your permission to not have compassion in times when you want to feel angry or when you are angry.
Thank you so much for that, Kim. I really appreciate. I think that's such an affirming thing to say, and especially important in being able to process things as they come and to allow yourself to authentically feel how you feel and then move forward from there. Jem Baldissimo has a question. She said, hello everyone, proud Filipina here and a member of ODU FASA. I agree with Keith. It can be tiring to advocate for equity and inclusion. In relation to this, how do we keep going despite everything that is going on? You know, I think in trying to be an active member in the community and to be somewhat what you were saying, Francis, as like being politically charged in multiple ways, like in the way that you identify as something that is political in nature, right? In fighting in all these different ways or advocating for not just yourself, but your community, I think that oftentimes we can get burnout very quickly. So how do you all as leaders in the community practice self-care and kind of safeguard yourself from experiencing, I guess, you know, just exhaustion? And how do you keep going throughout that?
Forgive yourself, first of all. Forgive yourself. Give it up for yourself. Because as we know in the Asian American community, the perfection syndrome, right, especially for teenage girls, I've seen it firsthand. My daughter was writing a biography. What does it mean to be strong? And I said, to be strong, you have to acknowledge that something hurts. You become strong when you say it hurts, but I can't let it keep me down. That's when you know you're strong. You're not strong by not feeling pain, right? It's kind of like level of tolerating pain, right? Like going to the dentist, of course. Hi, Dr. Bergamo, right? Like you still have to smile at the dentist. That's strength, right? He's gonna poke you, you see the needle, right? But you know it has to be done. If not, the cavity, the brushing teeth metaphor is there from Veronica, right? I think that's what being strong. Being strong is acknowledging it hurts. This sucks, but I'm gonna take a quick break and then I'll be back, right? So that's my big advice. And it's not just, then about the political thing, again, that's why I bring up Dr. Bergamo, right? Alan, right? He had to fight for his office. The government was taking his office. And imagine if he gave up. Here's the other thing. What is the counterpoint to giving up? Can we live with ourselves? Can we tell our children? Will it not bug us if we quit 10 years from now? Rather than, oh man, that really was so exhausting. It took 5 years of my life, but I did it. As opposed to, oh yeah, I quit. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it, right? So it's just a matter of deciding what can we live with, what can we live without, and then forgive yourself. No one will judge you, right? Only yourself.
Thank you, Francis. So I know that some attendees are starting to leave because the event was scheduled to end at 7. I will keep it open for as long as the panelists would like to participate. Of course, I don't want to ask too much of your time because I know this is late at night, but for those who want to stay and wish to stay, please feel free to. Sorry for interrupting, Francis.
I just think it's so crucial, like, especially with Zoom, right? And all the teachers can relate. The perfection syndrome is so crucial because even for teachers, like, again, for my teachers out there, and if there are parents like me who are also watching, do note, right? I had a very bad psychology teacher. That's why I'm obsessed with learning about psychology. When we are learning on Zoom, the brain of the American is trained, it's being cued that it's watching a show, which is perfectly edited, that is seamless. That is our expectation on the screen. So if I have to even bend over and pick up my pen, that disrupts the expectation of the AKA audience. So then, oh, professor was not ready. He left the screen, right? So right now in the pandemic, we are on this overdrive that we're always on. Like all of this is not normal. I think within 2 years, the journals will release the study on mental health and what happened to the brain and everything. So please don't apologize for slowing down. Like me, it's okay to be late. They will not go anywhere. They'll be on screen, right? And forgive yourself. So anyway.
I'd like to answer the question about self-care. because I totally hit a wall. You know, I've been running for office since January, and it culminated into a lot of coverage in the last month. And I have a lot of support, and I have a lot of internal support, like Melody. I've gone through all kinds of, I mean, I don't have a doctorate in counseling, but I've done all kinds of counseling for myself, you know. But if it weren't for all of those experiences, all of the projects that I've done with fawns in the past, where I was so into it for a year and then I had to drop out for like 5 years. You know, like, this work is a labor of love. It's our heart and soul. It's so worth it. You know, the people that we meet along the way become brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, you know, our other halves. We find ourselves in this work. But yeah, we all have to rest. It's important. We have to allow ourselves to take a necessary break, whether that break is for 8 hours or a day or 10 years. You know, we all have to know ourselves and then, right, navigate it differently the next time and forgive ourselves for crashing. But right, keep going, stay resilient, and know that it's worth it every moment.
So I'm just gonna like go, kind of piggyback after Dr. Francis and Tracie. You know, I'm all about compassion towards yourself and forgiveness towards yourself, because you can't really move forward without meeting yourself where you are. So as Dr. Kim said, like, if you're angry, be angry. Like today, like one of my interventions is like, and how do you express that? I was like, I don't, you know, or Filipino, we're taught not to express that, right? And I'm like, they think I'm crazy, but I'm serious. I was like, scream, let that out, let that energy out. That's a block inside of you. And so I told my husband this, because he's very angry at work. He's in the military. I probably shouldn't badmouth the military, but like, military is really stressful sometimes. You know, he comes home and I told him, he just laughed at me. And one day he actually did it. And he was like, and then like, this is months later, I forgot I even mentioned it. He was like, you were right. And I'm like, yeah, what about this time, right? And, you know, he tried it. He was just like, tried it. And, you know, I did it again and again. And it just like felt so good. So if you need to be angry, please be angry. I hope Jem is still on, because, you know, I'm appointed by the governor to serve on the Asian Advisory Board. And what I've learned there, like, I didn't know anything about politics before I joined the Asian Advisory Board in 2020. And now it's just like, hey, now you're health chair, now you're secretary, now plan a meeting for the governor, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm having conversations with like people at this legislative level. And if there's anything I learned, is that there are over 300 state boards. The Asian Advisory Board is only one. There are 300, and you know, each one of those boards has a civilian position. So if it's in your profession, there's a board on like restaurants, there's a board on where your lettuce comes from. I mean, I'm making that one up, but you know, there's a board on, you know, what chemicals you can put on your grass. Like, there's a board for everything. So whether or not you like, there's a board of counseling, there's a board of social work, there's a board of medicine. So like, join the board for your profession, join the board for something you're interested in. There's a board, you know, for education. We need Asian voices in upper level management and government positions. I don't know if you heard of like the bamboo ceiling. There's about 6% population is Asian, about 11% receive college degrees, about 6% is in the workforce, but about maybe 1% is in higher level positions. And so it doesn't match. Like, our voices need to be heard in every aspect of every corner, not just on the Asian Advisory Board, not just in the mental health field, not just in the advocacy circle, not just in the media. Our voice needs to be heard at every level, So what can you do? You can be the best version of yourself in whatever you're doing, and you can shine. And as you shine and you live in your authentic truth, you live in your power, you speak your voice, you are giving other people the permission to do the same. So I just encourage you all, like, thank you for being here. Like, thank you for all the work you're all doing, right? Like, I'm so proud to be among you. You know, like, they're like, Melody, you have a doctor to your name now. It took me 10 years to get my PhD. That was painful, right? And then now I'm still cowering because I faced those politics, right? I felt the weight of those politics. I felt the weight of being brown. I felt the weight of being less than 5 feet tall, right? But I don't need the skin color. I don't even need a degree, right? I don't need the title to use my voice. And so, like, if we're granting permission, right, I grant you permission to be authentically yourself and to continue to be the best version of yourself every day.
Thank you so much, Melody. I think that's so important, right? Like, being your most authentic self, owning that, but also the idea that we don't have to be on Asian advisory boards for our voices to be heard. That, like, we should be in all different spaces and have a seat at all different tables, and our Asian identities can inform our voice, but not just be allowed to speak when it comes to specifically, like, even like Asian advocacy. It needs to be more than just advocacy. We have to be present and sitting at various tables, right? So I think we'll just take the last question. Is from Dr. Gloria. She's actually asking this directly to Melody. So Melody, do you have any thoughts on what kinds of transformations or changes you think we need in the framework of mental health resources for AAPI and other students of color on universities and colleges?
I feel like I need a whole another panel for that. I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning. Mental health, like the model, if you want to read a book to kind of expand your knowledge of mental health in different cultural contexts, I'm on my second time reading it now. I assign it to all my students as an optional reading because I'm not allowed to change my curriculum. But it's called Crazy Like Us, the Globalization of the American Psyche. Like that I feel like is a loaded question because the premise of mental health was based on white values and white culture. And so to change and evolutionize like what we need for mental health is vast. It comes from an individualistic culture believing that we need to have talk therapy and individual therapy and retreat into ourselves to heal, where we're healing right now having these conversations. We come from a collective culture where we need each other to heal. We need to reach beyond what colonization said about who we are. And like, we need to learn about what are those historic truths and those traditions that how we healed back then that were erased or that were forgotten, and see what they say. You know, Nelly left, but she's a yoga instructor. So that's based upon the Indian modality of healing, right? Every other culture outside of the West, pretty much every other culture outside of the West doesn't isolate mental health. So like for me, I come from the wellness model of mental health. So this is actually what my book is upon, that is not published yet, but will be. I don't know how many years it's going to take. It took me 10 years to get my PhD, so we'll see. But like part of my passion is like teaching about the wellness model of the wellness approach of mental health. It's a holistic approach looking at your whole person, like there are 8 dimensions of wellness. So looking at your physical, emotional, social, economic, intellectual, like just different parts of you, and seeing like where the need is, where the gap is. So part of where, and like going back to the toothbrush, like I love that analogy, right? If we're thinking about the toothbrush, right? Like the biggest part about what mental health, like what the mental health needs are for the Asian community is knowing that we already had our truths and healing truths before Western mental health came, because it was integrated in everyday life. It was integrated in spirituality and how we ate and how we lived and how we did things. But when we separated that mental health, now we're displaced, right? We're not in our land. We're in a different land with a different cultural sets. So now we're influenced by both, right? Like that's kind of what the book is about. Like how do we navigate being influenced by both? Because they both could be value. I mean, I'm a counselor. Like I have to believe in my profession too, right? And so there is value and meaning in that. But like part of that, and we're going back to action, right? For us, mental health is more than just talk. It has to have the action, whether that action is like doing something yourself or doing something for your community, whether that action is connecting to like the roots of who you are, whatever that means to you. Like that's what's needed. What's needed is to know that it's okay to look at mental health in a different way. It's okay that like whatever we like create, that's uniquely our own, even if it doesn't look like what, you know, Western Counseling Center looks like, right? Or like a model, like even if we don't do CBT, like the most popular theory, like if we don't like change your thoughts, or even if we don't, you know, like follow all the trends, what is so frustrating to me right now is now all the somatic therapies and like other modalities that's popularizing now in mental health are from Asian traditions. Now the science is coming around, but we always knew that. So like talk about cultural appropriation, right? There's a big cultural appropriation in mental health. So what we need to do is reclaim our space and reclaim our authority in that. And I'm not sure if I'm answering any questions, but this is the work I'm working on personally too. So we can also have this conversation with you, Dr. Gloria, or with anyone else who wants to have this conversation, because I'm still in the process of figuring it out too. But we need to reclaim our space. And the only way we can reclaim our space is one, if we know what that is, and two, if we're confident in ourselves to do that. Like if we value ourselves enough, like I think I said this earlier, if I didn't, I said it in my head. Like, who am I to speak on this, right? Like, who am I to be a voice for Asian Americans? Who am I to be the voice of mental health? Well, I spent 10 years to get my freaking PhD. Like, I started talking about this when I was 4. You know, like, it doesn't matter. Like, we all have that right to ask questions. So redefining, I think, is what we need in the Asian mental health. Not trying to fit us in this bubble that was created by Western mental health therapists. We can create our own. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Reclaiming and understanding Western influence and reclaiming.
Yeah. Oh, like, I don't want to say like I hate it, right? But like, you know, taking the parts that make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Taking the parts that make sense.
Thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. I'm sorry to cut this so short. I loved this conversation and I wish we could keep it going, but I think we're going to end. But I think this is like, it carried on so long. We need to have another conversation. I think that's definitely, the conversation has to continue. So I appreciate your time so much, and I appreciate your thoughts and your perspectives and sharing that with us and with the wider ODU community, and providing an affirming space for more than just AAPI, you know, individuals. So thank you all, and thank you everyone in the audience, and I hope you all have a great rest of your night. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Old Dominion University for having me. You can find me, Keith Chao, on Twitter at @TheRealChao, _real_Chao. Follow the podcast at Southern Asians on Twitter and at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock Media Network. Subscribe and download Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Support us on patreon.com/thenerdscolor. Also find us on GoFundMe. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jess Vu. Email us, thenerdscolor@gmail.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thenerdscolor. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.